this session.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Barry and the Finger Lakes Permaculture Institute for inviting us to participate again in the annual Permaculture Week, this year of course online given the circumstances. My name is Greta Zaro and this is Ben Tyler of Unadilla Community Farm. We are based in West Edmiston, New York in Otsego County, and we are a nonprofit farm education center focused on the teaching and practice of sustainable skills. One of our main programs is a permaculture internship. So we actually have our interns in the background. You can't see them, but our interns are also listening into this presentation and maybe asking questions throughout the presentation. So in terms of the structure of this presentation, we will talk for about an hour and a half about our research on dynamic accumulators through a Northeast SARE grant. And then we'll open up for questions and discussion for the last half an hour of the presentation. So you can put questions and comments in the chat box throughout. And you can also use the raise hand feature when we get to that portion from 11:30 to 12, then we'll invite you to use the raise hand feature if you want. And you can do that by clicking participants and then click raise hand. And then we'll see that and we'll be able to unmute you. So I think with that, I will turn it over to you, Ben.
All right, good morning, everyone. So I just wanted to start by giving a little more of an introduction to Unadilla Community Farm, that we are situated on 12 acres in West Edmiston, and we are showcasing a variety of sustainable agroforestry practices, including multi-story cropping. We have about a 6-acre food forest with over 200 varieties of cold hardy fruit and nut trees, as well as hundreds of different varieties of berry bushes and mushrooms and herbs. And then we also do annual vegetables as well, and alley cropping between the rows of fruit trees. And we're also showcasing many different companion plant relationships in the orchard, like having pollinator attractors planted around our fruit trees to attract pollinators at the time when the fruit trees are in need of pollination, companion plants and different perennial herbs that provide habitat for pollinators and also for predators to help prey on our different pest populations. Aromatic pest confusers is another category of companion plants to help ward off bad pests. And then we also are growing lots of dynamic accumulators, which we have been using for a few years to make perins and liquid fertilizers that we fertigate the orchard with. And so about a year ago, we started looking into it and looking under the hood at dynamic accumulators and the research that has been done on them, and started realizing that there hasn't really been a lot of peer-reviewed empirical research done on dynamic accumulators. And that since the term was first coined in the 1980s, there's been a lot of talk about dynamic accumulators, a lot of informal research and anecdotal reports of different plants being used for dynamic accumulation. And not a lot of solid research or research going into peer-reviewed journals about it. So that for some people is discouraging and suggests that maybe dynamic accumulators isn't real. But then I remember my permaculture training and that there are no negatives. There's only opportunities that haven't been explored. And the fact that there's so many people around the world that are coming back with reports of how they're using dynamic accumulators and using different plants for dynamic accumulation with great success, that suggests that there's actually a big opportunity for research in this area. And so this winter, we started a research project funded by the Northeast SARE, looking at 6 dynamic accumulator species that we're growing here on the farm and testing them. So that's the broad overview. And now let me get into some more detail. So the term of dynamic accumulators was first coined in the 1980s, I think maybe in 86, by Robert Korik. And he compiled a list of different plants that had been used to accumulate different nutrients. So the way the dynamic accumulators work is they are with their roots. They're also called mineral miners, that they are mining for different nutrients in the soil and bringing those nutrients up and making them bioavailable to other plants through their foliage. So then their foliage is very nutrient rich, and that drops on the surface and creates a nutrient-rich mulch. Comfrey is a big name in the dynamic accumulator world. It's sometimes called the most highest yielding crop in the world in terms of tons per acre, and is a big one that's used a lot for dynamic accumulation, that has very deep taproot that can go down to 12 feet deep. And at least the theory is that it's mining for minerals deep down in the subsoil, brings those up in a bioavailable form in its leaves, and then you can do chop and drop. With comfrey here on the farm, we have several rows of English comfrey, some Phytum officinale, which we then chop and drop with about once a month, and then have the nutrient-rich leaves decomposing around the bases of our fruit trees as a nutrient-rich mulch. We also make a perrine, or a liquid fertilizer, with the comfrey leaves. We have large 275-gallon caged white water tanks, or IBC totes, which is a like a globally ubiquitous water tank that's very available all over the world. And so we make large tea bags with comfrey leaves, stuff them in the tank, leave them. In 2 or 3 weeks, the leaves will be completely dissolved, and then you have a nice putrid smelling liquid that is supposedly high in nitrogen and other nutrients. And so we've been showcasing growing dynamic accumulators for some years, and now we're interested in helping to prove or disprove their efficacy. Yeah, so there's been lots of talk about dynamic accumulators, lots of lists being put forward in books like Gaia's Garden and other pretty well-known books on the topic. Compilations of different plants that anecdotal reports show that they've been used for dynamic accumulation with success. And just in the past 10 years or so, people have started to question the efficacy of dynamic accumulators based on the lack of research on the topic. So in the Permaculture Research Institute, there's John Kitzsteiner made an article that was pretty well known, talking about, I think it was the facts on dynamic accumulators, and yeah, pointing out the lack of credible research onto them. Robert Korik, who was the first to coin the term, has actually walked back his claims about dynamic accumulators, and yeah, recognizing the lack of research in it, and he actually put forward some suggestions for further research going forward. A lot of what he has said is what we've based our current research project on. So Robert Korik has suggested that for a plant to qualify as a dynamic accumulator, we need to do research to provide evidence in parts per million of the actual amounts of nutrient or mineral accumulation, and then compare that to other plants. He also actually laid out the groundwork pretty well, that he knows there's Dr. Duke, with Dr. Duke's phytochemical and ethnobotanical databases, which is a database that USDA maintains. And it's a curated list of, you can see different like historical uses of herbs and plants, and also it's a compilation of research that has gone into peer-reviewed journals showing like plant tissue analysis and the nutrient levels in different parts of the plant. Research that has been done on that that's made its way into peer-reviewed journals. And so there's actually a couple thousand entries in that database showing a lot of the nutrient values in parts per million for plants. And so in response to CORIC's recommendations for further research, we did analysis of the USDA phytochemical databases, took the 2,000 different plant entries in there and analyzed them to figure out what are the average nutrient levels in parts per million for different macro and micronutrients, and then tried to decide on a threshold for a plant to qualify as a dynamic accumulator. And then we had to decide on what the threshold would be. And that's actually also pretty well laid out for us. There's Dean Brown, also of the Permaculture Research Institute, who he's pointed out the similarities between dynamic accumulators and hyperaccumulators, which is another group of plants that is being researched in peer-reviewed journals. And so hyperaccumulators are plants that are used for soil remediation. So plants that, like plant tissue analysis, shows that the plants accumulate exceptionally high levels of nutrients, of harmful nutrients that need to be removed from land. And so there's a lot of research done on those, and Dean Brown suggests that with dynamic accumulators, we could just use a classification system just based on hyperaccumulators. That what they do is they have the dried plant tissue samples, and then they measure in parts per million the nutrient content of the different nutrients, and then establish thresholds based in parts per million, to see if a plant qualifies as a hyperaccumulator of that nutrient. So between CORIC and Brown, we pretty much had our work cut out for us and had it all spelled out there. So it was just a matter of downloading the USDA databases and doing the analysis on them. So what we did is we first figured out the average nutrient values across all the different nutrients. So let's take calcium, for example, which is a big one. So there's 841 entries for calcium. That's 841 different plants or parts of plants that have been tested, and the results showing up in peer-reviewed journals for their calcium content. And the average calcium content for plant tissue across the database was about 9,400. So let's just say 10,000 to round it off. So then we were trying a few different ways of establishing a threshold. First, we tried just doubling it. So 200% of 9,400, we got 18,800 parts per million. A plant would have to have 18,800 parts per million of calcium in its plant tissue, and then that would be twice the average. And that would also put it in the top 14% of all plants. So only 14% of plants would, on file, would qualify as a dynamic accumulator of calcium. And so then what we did is, because the phytochemical database is an ever-changing thing as new data is being added to it, we didn't want the threshold to be linked to a percentage of the averages, because then it would be changing every time new entries were put into the database. So we rounded it from 18,800 parts per million to 20,000 parts per million. And so now we have a stable threshold at 20,000 parts per million, which currently accounts for 12% of the plants. So in order to be a dynamic accumulator of calcium, a plant would have to have 20,000 parts per million of calcium in a dried plant tissue sample and have that data be in peer-reviewed journals, and then that results in only 12% of plants qualify. And so we did this analysis across a range of macro and micronutrients. And so then we had a list of many plants that could potentially be used as dynamic accumulators just based on that, based on their nutrient levels. We also did a large literature review looking at all the plants that permaculture practitioners around the world have reportedly been using with success for dynamic accumulation, which ended up in a very long list. So we have, let's see now. We have here several hundred plant species that are reportedly being used for dynamic accumulation with success around the world, and then a couple hundred plant species that, using the USDA databases and with these proposed thresholds that we've put forward, qualify as dynamic accumulators. And then the exciting part is comparing those two lists and seeing what plants show up on both lists, what plants both meet the thresholds that we put forward as a dynamic accumulator and are currently being used and reportedly with success by permaculture practitioners around the world. And then that results in a short list of what I consider to be the most promising plants for further study. By the way, Greta put in the chat box a link to an article that we published through the Permaculture Research Institute this March. And in that article, there's links to everything that I'm talking about here. Links to our analysis of the Dr. Duke's database, and a link to the lists of dynamic accumulators identified by the permaculture community, dynamic accumulators that meet the thresholds based on the USDA databases, and the overlap list. So right now, pulling up that list, I have here 70 species of plants that fall on both lists. So in terms of setting thresholds for a plant to qualify as a dynamic accumulator, I think that this is really just the first step, that there's still so much more. This is basically now just set the stage and pave the way. For now, there's a lot of research that has to be done, examining exactly how these plants work and what's going on and what are some potential applications for them. For example, the idea that dynamic accumulators are mineral miners that are mining for these nutrients deep underground using their long taproots. Well, a lot of the plants on this list do have long or deep root systems, and a lot of them do not. And the ones that do have deep root systems, like Comfrey, for example, is Comfrey's deep taproot really mining for minerals, or is that more just about tapping into moisture deep underground? And is the majority of its mineral mining actually taking place in the topsoil, in which case it would be robbing nutrients from the surrounding plants? Yeah, and at the same time, there could be potential applications for both, for shallow-rooted dynamic accumulators to prevent the leaching of nutrients or nutrient runoff by quickly absorbing it into plant foliage before it runs off or leaches down into the subsoil. Whereas the deep-rooted dynamic accumulators could be drawing up new nutrients to add to the nutrient levels at the topsoil. Also, the ability to move nutrients from one field or one row to another, like both the shallow-rooted and the deep-rooted dynamic accumulators could be useful for that. Yeah, so a lot of questions surrounding the root depths. And so this is one of the things that we'll be testing now. We've begun a 2-year-long research project at our farm here at Unadilla Community Farm. So we've chosen 6 dynamic accumulator species to test, and we have test rows of them establishing in the orchard right now. And over the next 2 years, we'll be taking soil tests at different levels in the soil, and then in the top 0 to 6 inches, 12 to 24, or 6 to 12, and then 12 to 24 inches deep, to see what's going on with the nutrient levels underground. Are these plants actually depleting nutrients in the topsoil with shallow roots, or are they drawing them up from deep underground? And then we can be looking at the different soil depths and the nutrient levels there to see where the nutrients are being drawn from. And then another question that we have is like the potential application. So now we have the plant foliage high in these nutrients, supposedly. So then we'll be doing a plant tissue analysis on the plant foliage to confirm that the nutrients are showing up in the leaves as opposed to being in the roots, which isn't particularly practical for use. Like chop and drop is definitely the favorite and easiest method of harnessing the nutrients, and that would require the high nutrient concentrations to be in the leaves, in the above ground growth of the plant. And then also the use of making like liquid fertilizers. We use non-aerated liquid extraction, so basically just steep tanks, and not for too long, as opposed to like a compost tea where you have aeration and it could go for longer periods of time. But what we want to do is develop a simple non-aerated method of steeping the plant foliage just for a couple of days or so, and then having water-soluble nutrients in the liquid fertilizer that could then be used as a foliar feed or for fertigation. And yeah, so another part of our study will be testing non-aerated liquid plant extractions over different periods of time and at different temperatures to try to develop best practices for harnessing the nutrients that way. And then also with the famous chop and drop method, monitoring soil nutrient levels with soil that is being chopped and dropped on versus not, with the 6 different species that we're testing, to see yeah, like exactly how many pounds of plant material do you have to chop and drop on a row in order to have a measurable increase in parts per million of a specific nutrient on that row. Yeah, these are important questions in order to turn dynamic accumulators into a useful tool that farmers could use and to calculate yeah, the changes in soil nutrient values that they can expect. So talking more about our study and the 6 plant species that we've chosen to study. So looking at the short list of the plants that are both being used for dynamic accumulation by the permaculture community currently, and the list of plants that the USDA databases confirm that they do have more than double the average nutrient levels for different nutrients. We then needed to narrow that down because that brought us to 70 different species. So then we were looking at plants that it would be practical for farmers to grow for dynamic accumulation. And for me, that means it would have to be low maintenance, like a perennial or self-seeding annual, it would have to be good for farmers in the Northeast. So it would have to be cold hardy down to zone 4 at least, which is the zone that we're at. And we also wanted to be testing plants with a variety of root depths. Yeah, so that we could be looking at the changes in soil nutrient values at different depths. And then also looking at the nutrients of the different plants. We did not want plants that were accumulating high levels of sodium, that would not be beneficial to be having sodium buildups in the soil. So for example, borage was one potential dynamic accumulator. It's a self-seeding annual that does grow in zone 4, and so therefore would be relatively low maintenance. And it's been demonstrated it has 350% the potassium above the average. It has more than double the magnesium in its foliage. So that seems promising, except it also accumulates 5 times, almost 6 times the sodium in its foliage compared to other plants. So then that one had to be eliminated. Yeah, and we also wanted to choose plants that accumulate a variety of different nutrients so we could test for different nutrients. So the short list of the plants that we're testing then are stinging nettle, Urtica dioica, which according to the Dr. Duke's database, it does show more than double nutrient levels for nitrogen, calcium, magnesium, sulfur in its foliage. There's also lamb's quarters, Chenopodium album. Dandelion, Taraxacum officinale, is a big one that shows up on a lot of lists as a dynamic accumulator that's currently being used by permaculture practitioners, and also Dr. Duke's database confirms in several nutrients. Red clover, Trifolium pratense. Pigweed, or Amaranthus retroflexus, is a big one, and really all Amaranthus species. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and Comfrey. And Comfrey is actually one that doesn't show up in Dr. Duke's database, or that the only data in peer-reviewed journals on Comfrey is plant tissue analysis of the root, which is the part that's traditionally used for herbalism and medicine. So there's actually no data available on the nutrient content of Comfrey's foliage, which would be the part that would be used for dynamic accumulation. So for Comfrey, we made an exception, and we're studying that one, even though it does not show up on both lists, that there is no data on it in Dr. Duke's database, but because it definitely has the biggest reputation as a dynamic accumulator, and also as the highest yielding plant in the world in terms of tons per acre, suggesting that it's worth studying. And yeah, this also, Comfrey sort of points out a limitation in the use of thresholds for qualifying as a dynamic accumulator, which is even if Comfrey's foliage does not show super high levels of a certain nutrient, if that plant is pumping out huge amounts in terms of tons per acre of foliage, then that would be an accumulation of nutrients that would be faster than a plant that's more slow growing, but you might only be able to get 1 cut per season, and it would have very high nutrient levels, as opposed to Comfrey that you can get 5 or 6 cuts per season, and you might be able to affect the same nutrient changes in your soil that way. Yeah, another limitation of the the research we're currently doing is that at present, the model fails to fully encapsulate how dynamic accumulators are being used around the world at the moment. For example, in addition to treating specific nutrient deficiencies, dynamic accumulators are also used just to apply balanced nutrient levels to healthy soils. So perhaps a new category of dynamic accumulators needs to be created where a balanced nutrient profile for healthy soil is agreed on, and plants qualify according to how closely they approximate this ideal, as opposed to plants demonstrating an exceptionally high nutrient level of one particular nutrient. Also, with the suggestions made by Kurek that we're basing our research on, there are several other suggestions that he makes that the current threshold model does not follow. For example, Kurek suggested that information on potentially toxic or micronutrients that are rarely deficient, like copper and boron and cobalt, that the dynamic accumulators of these nutrients should be excluded. And we decided instead to include thresholds for all the nutrients currently found in the USDA databases, in recognition that there may be rare circumstances where these nutrients are found to be deficient. And also to recognize that it is possible to overdo it with the accumulation of any nutrient in plant tissue or soils, resulting in nutrient imbalance. Yeah, so we are establishing thresholds for dynamic accumulators for all nutrient levels, and then leaving it up to the practitioner to identify the ideal balance of nutrient values that they need for their soils. Yeah, and one last thing on the limitations of this model using thresholds is that the thresholds for dynamic accumulators established here should not be used to discourage people from experimenting with other plant species not on the list. As mentioned earlier, balanced and healthy soils could be achieved using other plants that accumulate more balanced nutrient levels. And also the fact that there's so much missing data, yeah, that the data we do have on plant tissue nutrient levels in the phytochemical databases is very slim, and there could actually be yeah, a lot of research opportunities just taking plant tissue samples and doing analysis of nutrient levels for all the plant species growing around us. That there's actually very few that we actually have data on. Yeah, and I think that is basically the gist of the research that we're doing here. So we have 13 rows that are being tested. We have 6 species of dynamic accumulators, and that we're testing, 2 rows for each, so that's 12, plus 1 fallow row, and that's the 13th row. And that's the control row. So as we're monitoring nutrient levels in the soil over the next 2 years, we'll be checking it against the control row to see if these plants are moving nutrients around or removing them from one section of the soil. With the 6 test crops, each one being grown in 2 rows, one of those rows will be used for chop and drop. So we will be chopping and dropping onto the row the plant tissue that's growing there, and then monitoring in the topsoil the changes in the nutrient levels in the topsoil as the chop and drop plant tissue then breaks down and starts enriching the topsoil. And then the other row will be used to make non-aerated liquid plant extracts in our 275-gallon IBC totes. To see how much of the nutrients in the plant tissue are water soluble. So we'll be taking plant tissue samples and having them tested for different nutrient levels, and then steeping the plant tissue for 1, 2, and 3 days, and testing the liquid fertilizer nutrient levels over those days. So we can come up with a plan for Northeast farmers, to get the best bang for your buck when you're making your own liquid fertilizer from these plants. And we'll be doing this over the next 2 years, or this is year 1 that's going right now. And in this year, we are establishing the rows of dynamic accumulators, and they're all booming out there right now because we did choose 6 very easy to grow species. And then we'll be setting up the steep tanks and equipping them with thermometers and strainers, and coming up with a just a low-cost, low-tech way for farmers to make their own liquid plant fertilizers from these species. And then by the end of next year, hopefully we'll be able to report back with some information and fact sheets on best practices and the nutrient levels that farmers can hope to expect from their liquid fertilizers that they're making, and also from chop and drop.
There's a question that came in on the chat. Are you tracking putrid levels too?
Yeah, so for the liquid fertilizers, that's a big part of it, is especially because it's non-aerated steep tanks, we need to be watching the pH. So like, I guess ideally we'd be at about 70 degrees, or the water in the steep tanks would be at 70 degrees, and then it might be 2 or 3 days to get the best nutrient levels in the liquid fertilizer. But the longer you leave it, the more chance there is for fermentation, and it would be anaerobic since we don't have bubblers in there, and then that would create a pH imbalance. So we'll be watching the steep tanks and find the sweet spot at different temperatures, different ambient temperature, for how long to let it steep to get the best nutrient values without having anaerobic acidification going on.
Yeah, and that gets back to what you were saying about trying to make it as accessible as possible, like for Northeast farmers, in terms of, not needing a bubbler and kind of not needing the special equipment, and choosing plants that grow really fast and are easy to grow, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that is the end goal of all this, is to have a low-cost, low-tech solution for farmers all over the world, and especially here in the Northeast, since that's where our research is taking place, and the ambient temperatures that we're dealing with are here in the Northeast, and the plant species that we're growing are ones that can excel here in the Northeast. Yeah, but coming up with a model for on-farm liquid fertilizer production using the globally ubiquitous IBC tote, to just have a low-tech, low-cost system of nutrient management for farmers around here.
Do you want to say anything else about the grant or the process for the Northeast SARE grant? This was a Northeast SARE farmer grant that we applied for.
Well, I guess the process for the research is that it'll be spanning 2 years, and we're in year 1, in which we are establishing the rows of dynamic accumulators and setting up the steep tanks for the research, everything, and also a rainwater collection system that will be using rainwater for our steep tanks, just to ensure that our test results and everything are not being interfered with by like hard water or minerals present in groundwater or surface water already. So we're setting up we have a rainwater catchment system on the farm already, and we're setting up a bigger one that's dedicated to the research project. So that then next year, once the rows of dynamic accumulators that we're testing are fully established, then we can start doing the testing of the plant tissue, the soil in the chop and drop rows, and the liquid fertilizer that we'll be making.
There's a question here. I'm interested in knowing more about how you might investigate further the question about mining minerals from surface soil or deeper.
All right, so what we're doing to address that is we have a control row, so we just have one fallow row, and we are taking soil tests at 3 depths, at 0 to 6 inches for the topsoil, 6 to 12 inches, and then 12 to 24 inches. And we took the first round of soil tests in the spring for the baseline, and then we'll be testing again next spring, and then again the following year. So then we'll be able to be tracking over a 2-year period changes in nutrient levels at the different depths in the soil. And then we can compare them to the control row. So the Comfrey row, for example, is it going to show shrinking nutrient levels of certain nutrients in the subsoil and increasing nutrient levels in the topsoil, indicating that the nutrients are being moved from deep underground up to the surface through chop and drop? Or is Comfrey simply going to show a shrinking of nutrient levels in the topsoil, indicating that the mineral mining that's going on is actually just taking place in the topsoil? And so we will be comparing the changes in the soil nutrient levels in the Comfrey row with the control row, where there's nothing growing.
And those soil tests at the different levels, that was a recommendation from our technical advisor, right? So yeah, we would encourage you all to really look into the Northeast SARE research grants or farmer grant. I keep saying research grants, it's really called farmer grant. There are different grants for different institutions as well, but we use the farmer grant, which is very accessible. You don't have to have a nonprofit structure, which we do have now, but at the time when we applied, we didn't even have that. You can apply as an individual farmer to these grants. There are SARE grants in all different regions. If you're tuning in and you're not from the Northeast, there's a SARE for your region. So we would definitely encourage you to look into that. And I wanted to bring in this because one of the pieces of the grant is to partner with a technical advisor. So we ended up partnering with Sean Bluthenthal of Cornell University, who recommended doing the soil tests at the different levels. And so the technical advisor just kind of works with you throughout the project and gives you advice and feedback along the way. Are you ready for more questions? Sure. Okay, so yeah, please do put questions and comments in the chat. We have some more coming in. I wonder if plants being used in polycultures would impact nutrient levels versus rows of individual species.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and that's more in line with how dynamic accumulators are currently used, or that is like one popular way of using them in a polyculture. In the interest of coming up with some results that are clear and easy to understand what's going on, we're doing them in dedicated rows. That if we were growing them in polycultures, it would be difficult to conclude whether it is the dynamic accumulator that's resulting in the movement of nutrients through the soil, or if it's some of the other species there in the polyculture. So that's why for this study, we've set up the 13 dedicated test rows. Yeah, but we do also, a Unadilla community farm, grow dynamic accumulators in polycultures and in guilds or on their fruit trees also.
What are some of the overlaps between hardy dynamic accumulators and other accumulators?
And hyperaccumulators?
Oh, the hyperaccumulators.
Some overlaps. Well, I might be able to answer that by looking at, so let's see, hyperaccumulators, cobalt, for example, or boron, and lead are different things that hyperaccumulators accumulate. And those are not being tested in our study because those are not particularly useful. There is one, basically Brassica oleracea and all brassicas in general show up a lot, both as hyperaccumulators and dynamic accumulators. And that's one family of plants that Corrick suggested are not included for use as dynamic accumulators, as they have been found to accumulate toxic nutrients as well. Yeah, so hyperaccumulators are accumulating cobalt, copper, although copper is one that's also useful. I think it's more about, even boron also is essential for plant growth. It's more just about understanding what it is you're looking for when you're using dynamic accumulators, rather than just trying to get the highest numbers possible across the board, is understand how the different nutrients interact and like what are ideal levels of different nutrients for your plants, that any of them you could overdo them and there could be deficiencies, but then there could also be excesses. Yeah, and then manganese, nickel, and zinc are also ones that are accumulated by hyperaccumulators for soil remediation, but that are also useful in trace amounts for soil health.
And going back to what you were saying earlier about hyperaccumulators, that process of doubling it or looking for 200% and then setting a threshold, that was the same process that was used for the definition of hyperaccumulators too? Or how did you get to that? Can you clarify, how did you get to that process of doing that?
So with hyperaccumulators, it's not so much a doubling of the average. I'm not sure how they decided on the hyperaccumulator thresholds, but it's just plants to do a very good job at it, and like many times much more than double. So for dynamic accumulators, we chose set thresholds that are about double, based on Coric's recommendations that it should be relative to the other plants. And also because dynamic accumulators, I think, don't have to be, it doesn't have to be as extreme as hyperaccumulators, that a plant could be useful for dynamic accumulation, even if it is, only double or triple or quadruple the average, that, then that plant could still be useful, because we're not talking about like rapid nutrient transfer, just more a gentle nutrient management around the farm.
And we have another comment coming in. I have heard that we shouldn't grow food near the home because of possible lead and other chemicals. I wonder if it makes sense to grow some of these near the foundation of old homes.
That's a good question. Yeah, there's lots of lead from lead paint on houses that is then poisoning the soil around houses. Also asphalt roofs that are super common and cheap nowadays are also poisoning the soil around the house. And that's a whole other can of worms. And actually here at Unadilla Community Farm, we also hold workshops and teach about natural building and avoiding things like that. And you might cut costs by using toxic materials in the construction of a home, and it seems like a good idea at the time, and then next thing you know, there are chemicals leaching into your soil and into your garden beds around your house. So then that would be more like hyperaccumulators then, to identify, is it lead from lead paint, and then you can look up the list of established hyperaccumulators that can be used to remove the lead from around your house, in which case then you would grow the hyperaccumulator, get the largest amount of plant tissue that you can, and then bag it up in plastic bags and send it to the landfill to remove it from your site.
Okay, we have more questions coming in. Please do use the comments to put the chat box to put comments and questions. And you can also use the raise hand feature. If you would like to speak, you can click participants and then click raise hand, and then we will see your digital hand, and then we will call on you. And also a reminder that we have our interns here. You can't see them, but they're listening in to this workshop. And interns, you can also raise your hands and ask questions and comments throughout this discussion. Okay, so the next one coming in, are you looking at the relationship that these dynamic accumulators have with the surrounding native ecosystems as well?
In this study, we are just looking at the movement of nutrients. So doing the soil testing at different levels, plant tissue analysis, so taking plant tissue samples and testing that for nutrient levels to see what's present in the foliage versus the roots of the plant, and then testing the effects of chop and drop and testing the liquid fertilizer. Yeah, and we have them in isolated rows, so we can just be tracking the nutrients and their movement with that specific species. And yeah, to keep it very simple for the initial research, we're not looking at any relationships between different plant species.
Well, that could totally be the subject of a follow-up grant that someone on this call could write.
There's really so many unanswered questions about dynamic accumulators, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, but there could definitely be several lifetimes spent just answering all the questions surrounding these plants.
Okay, can you share other practical applications of dynamic accumulator use in our home gardens?
Okay, so I can tell you about some applications for dynamic accumulators that are currently being used. Keep in mind that none of this has really been tested or verified, that it's all based on just anecdotal reports or informal research by home gardeners or permaculture practitioners. Yeah, but so you have the mineral mining to be bringing nutrients up from deep underground and making them bioavailable to other plants. So then that would be like comfrey planted in a polyculture. So comfrey having a deep root. So as nutrients are leaching or trickling down through the soil levels, and then they get below the reach of the root structures of other plants in the polyculture, but then comfrey with its deep root can still access those nutrients and bring them back up to the surface in its foliage. Then there's shallow rooted dynamic accumulators. They could be used to prevent like surface runoff of nutrients. As nutrients are moving horizontally across the surface, like in a heavy rain, and then that could get caught. And I see that being really useful for planting or incorporating dynamic accumulators when planting buffers around the garden or around the farm. And there's several tree species that show up in the short list of dynamic accumulators that both are being used with success by practitioners around the world, and that they also demonstrate exceptionally high levels of different nutrients. So like tree species and also ground cover being incorporated into the planting of buffers to prevent nutrients from traveling off your land horizontally. Also moving nutrients from one bed to another. If you have some wild land, some uncultivated land, and then you could have dynamic accumulators growing there to sort of extract certain desirable nutrients from that land. And then you could brush hog them or chop them and then transport them over and use them as mulch on your garden beds as a way to move nutrients around from one bed to another. And so in that way, you could also isolate nutrients if you have fallow land that is getting its nutrition from a heavy mulch or from manure. And then you're growing a dynamic accumulator there with exceptionally high levels of one particular nutrient. So then you can use that plant to extract a certain nutrient from that bed, and then be able to bring just that one nutrient to your cultivated plot. That would be a way to avoid like sodium buildup from like manuring directly on your garden bed. Like leave the sodium in the other bed and be able to just take the desired nutrient and bring it to your garden bed. Yeah, there's really lots of potential applications, which theoretically all could be really useful. And now we just need more people to do rigorous research in an empirical way and everything, so that we can start proving or disproving whether these theories are practical. Yeah.
Another question coming in. Do you have any experience in using Korean green radish or any daikons for dynamic accumulation? I have seen them referenced both for harvest and letting the leaves compost, and for leaving the root in the ground to rot to fertilize over the winter for the next season.
Yeah, so radish as a cover crop is a popular option, and also to help with decompacting the soil and everything. That's not one that we have used for dynamic accumulation. And I'm not sure if that one shows up on the short list. Now I'm just pulling up, this is a link that's in our article that Greta put a link to in the chat box. And so then you can click that. It's by the Venn diagram showing the overlap list between the community dynamic accumulators and USDA dynamic accumulators to see what species fall on both lists. And that's just publicly available on the article. And I'm not sure if the radishes are daikon. There is brassica in general. All the species of brassica do show up on both lists a lot. So those are big ones.
Yeah, I'll put the link again in case you missed it, copying it in the chat.
Pretty far up there now.
Yeah, that's the link to our article. And as Ben said, we put the links to our spreadsheets in the article, so you can access those directly. Okay, any other questions or comments? Again, you can put it in the chat box or use the raise hand feature. Ben, while we're waiting for more questions to come in, maybe you can talk a little bit more about sort of the process that we've done so far. So you mentioned the soil testing, then just talk a little bit more about how we established the rows this season and direct seeding versus transplanting, that kind of thing.
All right, so since one of the big qualifying factors for these 6 species that we're testing is that it's very easy to grow and very low maintenance, because we're hoping to be able to develop a really low tech, low effort, low maintenance method for people to be using these plants. We don't want the growing of dynamic accumulators to be taking too much of people's time away from the crops that they're actually trying to cultivate for use. So we chose species that would do very well autumn sowing or just broadcasting seeds. However, since we're on a timeline here with a schedule to keep with the 2-year study, we started our seeds in trays indoors in our high tunnel and then transplanted them out to make sure that our test rows would be having like even coverage of plants, and with the root systems, evenly saturating the soil in the bed. So we didn't want to take any chances by autumn sowing. Now that we have transplanted plugs, and they have evenly established across the bed, I think we will also be broadcasting this fall into those beds just to top them up and to try to get as thick a ground cover as we can with those test crops. Also to try to get some visible results from the study, because I think 2 years is also a pretty short timeline to be operating on, and we will probably be applying for part 2 of this research to then be tracking the nutrient levels in these test rows for an additional 2 years after that, to see after 3 years of root growth and establishment, and after 4 years, does the rate of nutrient transfer accelerate as the root systems grow and take over the beds more and more. Yeah, so that's what we're up to this year.
Yeah, an observation that some of us and the interns made, we were out there weeding them a couple of days ago and we noticed that there were very few weeds. So they really are already doing a great job at filling in the bed. In the leaves of the plants are kind of providing shade and shading out potential other weeds. So they're already really establishing themselves fast.
Especially the broad-leafed species are especially good at suppressing other weed growth around them, like the in ours, the comfrey and the dandelion. And the redwood amaranth, also that's a really tall vertical grower, but also with broad leaves.
Okay, a couple other questions. Does plantain function as a dynamic accumulator?
Plantain. Well, let's see. I'm going to check the overlap list first. Okay, so plantain looks like one of those plants that there isn't really that much data on in the USDA database. So plantain is reportedly being used for dynamic accumulation just by the permaculture community around the world. However, the only data that we have from peer-reviewed journals on nutrient content of plantain is in its seed. And plantain seed does show to have exceptionally high levels of calcium. So that is one example of a plant that needs further study, that one could be seen as a potentially useful dynamic accumulator, but we need more nutrient samples of the foliage of the leaf and the stem instead of just the seed. The phytochemical database is in many ways geared towards herbal remedies and nutrition, and this is really the first time that it's being used to be studying plant foliage that's intended for nutrient management in soils rather than in our bodies. So yeah, that's one that could be a whole other study, would be taking plantain and then taking plant tissue samples from the leaves and sending that to be tested to verify if the foliage of plantain really is meeting the thresholds for dynamic accumulators.
Okay. Where might we find the results of your research in the future?
So we will be publishing a follow-up article through the Permaculture Research Institute to try to stay consistent and easy to find. So that's the website where we published our initial research, setting up the establishing the thresholds and laying out the basis of our research. So we'll be publishing there again in 1 year's time with the research results.
Yeah, I would also say you can go to our website, unadillacommunityfarm.org, and we post all of our articles there as well. And part of the grant, as Ben said, it's a 2-year grant. So the second year is, of course, testing all the plant material and making the parins and testing that, but also doing community outreach and sharing these results. So that's a big part of the SARE grant is, we're doing this to be a replicable model that other farmers in the Northeast can follow. So a big part of the grant was to write out what we would be doing, workshops, articles, fact sheets, etc. So we'll be creating all of those materials. So definitely check back on our website. Someone says, calcium. I have been harvesting the seeds from plantain that grows on its own in my garden. I toast it in cast iron and grind it to add to flour.
Wow. There you go. That's a great use for plantain. Fun. And Dr. Duke's phytochemical database confirms that your plantain seeds are very high in calcium.
All right. Any other questions or comments? We kind of sped through this. We're only at 11:07. Thank you. Yeah, you can also email us at unadillacommunityfarm@gmail.com and just get in touch with us. We want to be talking to others and sharing this research. And normally we would say come to the farm and check it out, but not this year. But hopefully next year we'll be opening up for farm tours again. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that sums it all up.
Okay, Rebecca, I guess we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I hope that in the future we can have more sessions and presentations like this one. It's just so amazing to see the research that's being done. Like you said, so much of what we do in permaculture hasn't really been researched. So sometimes we know it works just through years and years of practice, but it's so interesting to see the research behind these practices that we've adopted. So thank you so much for your work. Also, everybody check out their website. It's really, really interesting. I don't know, Greta, if you've put it in the chat there.
I can add it.
Okay, great. I just want to mention a few things, if you don't mind. The Finger Lakes Permaculture Institute is looking for new board members. So I am going to put the link to a Google form that you can use to nominate yourself or someone else. Being on the board, here's the link to that. Being on the board is an amazing experience. It's voluntary. We're a completely decentralized organization. We're a 501c3 dedicated to education. And our primary focus recently has been more on access, like creating more access to permaculture for more people and making permaculture more relevant to more people. So really expanding what applications that, what are all the applications to permaculture in our communities, in our schools, in our gardens, in our homes. So we have our board, we can have up to 9 members on the board. And we did that intentionally because when we run events like this, we divvy up the work amongst us. So we spread out the love. Right now we have 5 board members and 2 of us are going to be stepping down. So we're looking for several new board members. And I think it's also just a great opportunity for sort of a new generation of permaculturalists or permaculture inspired practitioners to step in and sort of help define, the work of FLPC. That's what we call ourselves, Finger Lakes Permaculture Institute, FLPC. So if you want to nominate yourself or someone else, please click on that Google form or copy that out of the chat so that you can do that. And I guess just lastly, I want to say, if you haven't seen the film yet, Coming Home, Interviews with Gaikono. Gaikono is the Cayuga Nation. Gaikono is their name in Gaikono. And the film talks a lot about their return to their land. And initially the film was made, initially the interview was about like the seeds returning to their land, but then the film actually became about the seeds and their return and ceremony and the importance of language and culture. So the film is being used as a tool for a fundraiser. And I'm going to put in here the link to the GoFundMe campaign. So if you'd like to see that film, you can just click on that link, make a donation, whatever you can afford, and you'll receive an email receipt with a link to the film in it. So that's it. And I'm done. That's all I need to say. I wanted to thank people for coming. Oh, there's one more session today that you should check out. It's Karin Olson will be doing a regenerative biz ecosystems, a design charrette experiment. That's from 3 to 5 p.m. So it's participating in an activity where we can define as a group. I think the question she's asking is, how can we work together for a just transition away from the extractive economy that is degenerating our ecosystems and communities towards an economy in which we can all thrive. So, and that is our last session for this year. So I will leave you to the final words for the session. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and the Permaculture Institute and everyone for joining us today. Again, do check out our website, unadillacommunityfarm.org, to stay up to date with what we're doing and be in touch with us. And thanks again. Have a good rest of your permaculture week.
Great. Thank you. Goodbye.